This time on Classic Motorcycle A to Z, it's the letter A. So I'm going to be spending the next couple of months on a major adventure. This doesn't mean we're going to leave you without content though. We're putting together a series of videos which we're calling Classic Motorcycle A to Z. So basically we're going to run through the alphabet and give some history and information about various classic motorcycle companies as we go. This time, not surprisingly being the first video, it's the letter A. AMAC is of course an Italian aviation company founded in 1912. However, after World War II the company found themselves needing to branch out, so in 1951 they introduced their first motorcycle. AMAC is best known for its 2- and 4-stroke engines with more or less horizontal cylinders, which started life as a sort of scooter motorcycle hybrid in 1951, but gradually growing in size through to 350 by the late 50s. And this did attract the attention of Harley Davidson, who purchased a 50% stake in the company in 1960, who would market a range of machines as Harley Davidsons in the US market. And whilst not a complete commercial success, it did provide Harley Davidson with Grand Prix success. Harley would buy the company outright in 1974, but would own it for just 4 years before selling it to the Castiglione brothers, who would rebadge the machines as Cagivas. AJW was a small British company founded by Arthur John Wheaton in 1926. But while most British motorcycles were produced in the Midlands, the AJW was produced in Exeter in Devon. The machines would often have Fox-based monikers, Grey Fox, Silver Fox, Vixen, that kind of thing, and they always used proprietary engines in their own frames, with the machines using classically Jap engines, but also Python engines, essentially Rogers' customer engine. These were high quality machines, but the company only had the capacity to produce around 250 bikes a year, at the very most. But fortunately, the management at AJW were fairly canny, and would steer the company through a number of crises, including the Great Depression, and even beyond the collapse of many of Britain's major players. The tiny AJW company was able to sell bikes well into the late 70s. The Alta Suzuki was a miniature trials machine developed by Peter Gaunt after he had left Royal Enfield Works. He joined Suzuki GB and initially began to sell machines which were essentially modified Suzukis. But 1970 would see the company develop its own frames. The first was a monocoque, which was not at all popular with buyers, but its tubular steel frame would prove much more popular, and the Alta would prove to be a very effective, lightweight trials machine. But Suzuki weren't exactly happy with somebody using their power units to develop a trials machine which was better than their own. So in 1970 they greatly increased the prices of their power units, effectively pricing Alta out of the market. So Alta took the reluctant decision to end production at the end of 1970. Ambassador was founded in the post-war era by one Kay Don. Kay had been a successful car racer at Brooklands and powerboat racer during the 1930s. Kay Don felt that he could find a market for a small, uncomplicated British motorcycle in the far-flung areas of the planet. And so in mid-1946 he established his company. The Ambassadors were fairly typical of machines of the period, using small Villiers engines. Their chassis were often a cut above the rest, using all welded construction made for them by Reynolds. And so in the transport-hungry market of the 1950s, Ambassador was indeed relatively successful, producing a range of machines from single-cylinder 147s to 250 parallel twins, all Villiers powered of course. But by the end of the 1950s, the company was actually beginning to lose interest in motorcycle production, and so in 1962 would sell their equipment and the rights to the name to DMW. Ariel was a company founded in 1870 by James Starley and William Hillman. The company originally built spoked wheels that were used on the bicycle industry, and William Starley would patent the design and named the company that produced them Ariel, because the bicycles looked as if they were floating on air. These wheels initially would be fitted to the mighty penny farthings, but would soon be seen on the safety bicycle, something incidentally that was invented by John Kemp Starley, James's nephew. The company would merge with Westwood Manufacturing, and in 1896 they would produce their first powered tricycle, and then into cars before producing their first motorcycle in 1901. Ariel was taken over by Charles Sangster in 1902, and by 1918 his son Jack had taken over the running of the bike division. And under his management, Ariel would greatly expand their motorcycle range, including 992cc V-twins. However, a major change would come to the company in 1926 with the arrival of Velpage, and he would for the first time design the company's first complete motorcycles using engines of their own manufacture. And Page would become a major figurehead in the Ariel story, designing a range of singles which would later become the Red Hunter series, a range of sporting singles which would remain in production through to the end of the 1950s. But Sangster felt the range needed something that would be range-topping and something that would grab attention, and he would find it in the mind of a young Edward Turner. Turner had conceived of a compact square 4 engine layout, and he had tried to sell his design to various companies but without success. But Sangster would see the potential as a range-topping design and brought Turner in to help make the machine a reality. And so the Square 4 or Squarial would arrive in Ariel's range in 1931, initially as an overhead cam 500cc machine. But it was soon realised that the engine would need to be bigger to make maximum use of the layout. So initially the engine was enlarged to 600cc and later to 1000cc's. Although by that time, the overhead cam had been replaced by much simpler overhead valve layouts. The Squarial would remain in production through until the end of the 1950s, but was only ever a modest seller as a large, comfortable and somewhat luxurious touring machine. In the late 50s, Velpage would turn Ariel on its head with the introduction of a range of parallel twin 2-stroke 250s, the touring leader and the sporting Arrow. And these would be the last true Ariels, if you ignore the Ariel 3, which I think pretty much everybody should really. And while it's often said that these machines were commercial failures, this is far from the truth, with the machines recording pretty good sales, but they were never quite as high as Ariel had hoped for, and parent company BSA were fairly reluctant to invest heavily in the development of the machine, because they were worried about the effect the Ariel would have on the sales of their own 4-stroke singles. So ultimately, the Leader and the Arrow, like Ariel themselves, were allowed to simply wither on the vine. AGS was named after Albert John Stevens, one of 5 Stevens brothers who began the production of engines from their workshop in Wolverhampton in 1897, and would initially produce 4-stroke engines for other motorcycle manufacturers, single cylinders and somewhat interestingly, parallel twins, just in case you thought Triumph came first. And so it would soon become obvious to the brothers that producing their own complete motorcycles would make good commercial sense, and so they would begin doing so in 1909. Although it would take the company another 2 years to really ramp up production. The first engine would be a 4-stroke side valve of just 292cc's, but this would eventually be replaced by a full 500cc single. But by the early 20s, the company had a full range of single-cylinder machines up to 500cc, as well as a 990cc V-twin. But the company did have an interesting competition, and would introduce their own overhead cam model in the late 20s, which by 1928 would be catalogued as a full customer model. But by the late 20s the company was beginning to stretch itself somewhat thinly, having now diversified into car production, which would leave the company vulnerable during the Great Depression. And when the downturn really did start to bite, AGS thought their best course of action was to innovate, and began to develop a range of interesting machines, some of which would never see full production. There was an inline 4 and a side valve V-twin in the same orientation as a modern Guzzi. But none of this would work, and the Stevens brothers would declare bankruptcy, and the AGS name would be picked up by Matchless and would go on to become a key element of the Collier brothers' AMC empire. But alas, from that point on the road at least, AGS machines would be little more than rebadged Matchlesses. On the racetrack, well, that was another thing altogether. The Ascot Pulling was the brainchild of one Cyril Pulling. Pulling had been developing his ideas in the motorcycle industry since the 1920s, when he had jointly painted a 2-stroke motorcycle with a pressed steel frame, and this would form the basic template for the later Ascot Pulling. The Pulling used a 500cc single-cylinder engine which was mounted horizontally. And while the bike's fully enclosed bodywork was obvious, it also made use of hydraulic brakes, and there was an optional screen which included a windscreen wiper. And there would be other innovations too, including a fully enclosed chain and interchangeable wheels. And indeed, for the riders in 1930, the machine must have seemed truly futuristic. But the Pulling faced some serious uphill battles. As a small manufacturer, the machine was expensive, and worst of all, it was innovative. This is a bad thing because in general, motorcycle buyers, particularly in the 1930s, were a fairly conservative lot. This unfortunately meant that less than 500 machines were ever sold. Hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. Look out, there will be more videos in the series coming soon. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.